On May 1st, 1963, a 16-year-old girl walked home from school in a quiet city north of Tokyo and never arrived. A ransom note arrived at her family's door that night. The police set up a trap to catch the kidnapper. He came, he got away, and 3 days later, the girl's body was found buried in a field. Under enormous public pressure, police needed someone to blame. They turned their attention to a neighborhood where people from Japan's most marginalized community lived. Within weeks, they had their man. The only problem is, he almost certainly didn't do it. Kazuo Ishikawa spent 31 years in prison. He was sentenced to death. He maintained his innocence every single day until he died at 86 years old, in 2025, just a few months ago. And the physical evidence that put him there? A published scientific study has now dismantled the most important piece of it. This is the Sayama incident, one of Japan's most bitterly contested wrongful convictions, and a story about what happens when a justice system decides who the guilty party is before it has looked at the facts. Sayama City in 1963 was a modest place in Saitama Prefecture, a farming region turning slowly suburban as Tokyo expanded north. It was the kind of community where a high school girl could walk home alone without anyone thinking twice. On the afternoon of May 1st, Yoshi Nakata, 16 years old, a first-year high school student, left school and headed home. She never made it. That evening, a letter arrived at her family's house. It was a ransom note. The writer demanded some £200,000 in cash, roughly $550 at 1963 exchange rates, and ordered Yoshi's family to bring the money to a location near their home at midnight the following night. Police were alerted and surrounded the meeting point with plainclothes officers. Yoshi's older sister was sent to carry the money to the spot. A man did approach her. He exchanged a few words, and then, for reasons that have never been fully explained, he sensed something was wrong, turned, and vanished into the dark. The officers at the scene could not catch him. This was a disaster for the Saitama Prefectural Police. The media criticized them ferociously. And it wasn't even their first failure that spring. Just 1 month earlier, they had also failed to apprehend a suspect in a separate kidnapping case in the same region. 2 public failures in quick succession. The pressure from both the press and politicians was enormous. On the morning of May 4th, police found Yoshi Nakata's body. She had been buried in a shallow grave in an alley running through farmland. An autopsy confirmed she had been raped and strangled. A teenage girl was dead. The man who had done it was gone. Yoshi's older sister, the woman who had carried the money to the midnight handoff, who had spoken to the killer and watched him walk away, would later take her own life, the grief apparently insurmountable. The entire family had been destroyed in 3 days, and the Saitama police, humiliated and desperate, needed a result. What happened next is where this case becomes something darker than a murder investigation. In Sayama City, there was a Buraku community, a neighborhood inhabited by people from Japan's historical outcast group, a group that had faced systemic discrimination for centuries and continued to face it in 1963, despite formal legal equality. Police launched what has been described as a sweep of this community. Not, supporters argue, because any evidence pointed there, but because of a deeply rooted assumption that violent crime was more likely to come from this kind of district. On May 23rd, 22 days after Yoshi disappeared, police arrested 24-year-old Kazuo Ishikawa. He was Buraku-born from this neighborhood. The charge they used to bring him in was unrelated to the murder, a separate matter entirely, used as a pretext to get him into custody. Ishikawa had grown up in poverty. He had received almost no formal education. By all accounts, he was functionally illiterate, unable to read or write complex text, let alone the kind of sophisticated, kanji-heavy sentences in the ransom note. But none of that stopped what came next. He was held for 47 days. Under Japanese criminal procedure at the time, a suspect could be detained for extended periods before formal charge, with severely limited access to an attorney. Ishikawa's lawyer was reportedly permitted only 5-minute visits. Meanwhile, Ishikawa was subjected to interrogation sessions lasting 16 to 17 hours a day. His supporters and his own account, and I want to be clear that these are disputed and denied by prosecutors, describe two specific tactics used to break him. First, it's alleged that investigators threatened to arrest his older brother, who was the main breadwinner for the family. Second, it's alleged that they promised him, "Confess, and you'll be freed within 10 years." On June 20th, Ishikawa confessed. He claimed he and 3 other men had kidnapped and killed Yoshi Nakata. The following day, he drew a map showing where Yoshi's school bag, which had not yet been found, was buried. Police found the bag at the location the map indicated. Then came the physical evidence. On June 26th, police found a fountain pen at Ishikawa's house, at the lintel, tucked above the doorframe. This pen was said to be the victim's. On July the 2nd, they found the victim's wristwatch. Those 3 elements, the confession, the map, and the recovered items, formed the spine of the prosecution's case. There was no DNA testing in 1963. There were no fingerprints of Ishikawa on the ransom note or on its envelope. And the ransom note itself had been written by someone clearly comfortable with complex Chinese characters. A level of written literacy Ishikawa simply did not have. His defense team raised this from the very beginning. In 1964, after a trial lasting roughly 6 months, Urawa District Court found Ishikawa guilty and sentenced him to death. During the appeal, Ishikawa retracted his confession in full. He said it had been coerced, that investigators had coached him through a version of events until he could recite it consistently. He denied ever killing Yoshi Nakata. The Tokyo High Court listened and then commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment, while refusing to overturn the conviction itself. The Supreme Court upheld the result. The question of who actually killed Yoshi Nakata in May 1963 has never been answered. The man who fled from her sister at the midnight handoff was never identified. No other suspect was ever publicly named or charged. What we can say clearly is that the Saitama Prefectural Police were under severe institutional and public pressure to produce a result. The media had humiliated them. Politically, they were exposed. And into that pressure came an opportunity. A Buraku man who could be arrested on an unrelated pretext and held long enough for a confession to be obtained. The Buraku Liberation League, Japan's central organization for the rights of the outcast communities, described Ishikawa's arrest almost immediately as a discriminatory indictment. Their argument was not subtle. Police had not come to the Buraku district because the evidence led there. They had come because of who lived there. When you look at the specific evidence problems, it is genuinely difficult to dismiss that argument. A man who cannot write kanji. A ransom note requiring someone who can. No fingerprints of Ishikawa on either the note or its envelope. A fountain pen found tucked above a door frame. A watch recovered separately. An alleged promise of freedom in 10 years. A promise that never came. Ishikawa served 31 years before parole. Then, decades later, a piece of hard scientific evidence emerged that supporters say changes everything. Researchers applied X-ray fluorescence analysis, XRF, to the actual physical evidence held at the prosecutor's office. The key finding, Yoshi Nakata's own handwriting samples and personal pen contained chromium in the ink, measured at between 65 and 112 parts per million. The fountain pen found at the lintel of Ishikawa's house, the pen the prosecution identified as the victim's pen, contained no detectable chromium whatsoever, less than 1 part per million. They were different pens. If the pen found at Ishikawa's house were genuinely the victim's pen, it would share the same ink chemistry as her known writing. It did not. Ishikawa's supporters argue this proves the pen was not Yoshi's at all, and was placed there, by whom and when remains unresolved. The defense lawyer's position, held across decades and multiple retrial applications, was that the watch, the pen, and the map to the school bag were all fabricated or manipulated to support a predetermined conclusion. The XRF findings, they argue, confirm what they had always maintained. Kazuo Ishikawa's case is, on one level, a textbook study in false confession, and false confessions are considerably more common than most people want to believe. Research in forensic psychology consistently shows that extended detention, combined with sleep deprivation, social isolation, Threats against people the suspect loves and false promises of leniency can produce confessions from innocent people. The mind under sustained stress begins to fragment. 47 days of 16-hour interrogation sessions with 5-minute lawyer visits is not an edge case. It is an extreme that most people would not survive with their certainty intact. But there is something specific to Ishikawa's situation that makes it even more legible. He was illiterate and had almost no experience with legal institutions or formal authority. The investigators questioning him held enormous power in a society where deference to authority was deeply embedded, and he was told, if this account is accurate, that someone he cared about, his brother, would face punishment if he did not give the interrogators what they wanted. When you add that to his educational disadvantage, to his isolation, and to the sheer duration of the pressure, a false confession does not become puzzling. It becomes almost predictable. What is particularly haunting is what the confession apparently meant to him. If the promise of freedom in 10 years was genuine, and I want to stress again this is alleged, then from Ishikawa's perspective, confessing may have felt like a survivable decision. A terrible one, but survivable. What he could not have anticipated was that he would be sentenced to death, that the sentence would eventually be commuted, and that 10 years would become 31. The broader social dimension of the case is this. Japan's Buraku community had experienced generations of institutional discrimination in housing, in employment, in marriage, and in the courts. There is documented evidence from other cases of police directing disproportionate attention toward Buraku districts when crimes occurred nearby. In that context, Ishikawa's arrest does not look like a random error born of desperation. It looks like a pattern of the system reaching for the nearest available outsider when it needed to produce someone. None of this diminishes the tragedy of what happened to Yoshi Nakata. A 16-year-old girl was killed. Her family was destroyed. Her sister, who had walked to that midnight handoff carrying fake money while police waited in the shadows, later took her own life. That grief was real, regardless of who the courts found responsible. But it is possible to hold two things at once. The genuine horror of a young life cut short, and the genuine possibility that in the chaos and pressure that followed, an innocent man was taken and destroyed by a system that had decided what it needed to find before it began looking. Kazuo Ishikawa died on March 11, 2025. He was 86 years old. He had served 31 years in prison, been released on parole at 55, and spent the 3 decades that followed fighting for a retrial that never came in his lifetime. 3 retrial applications were rejected. When he died, the 3rd application died with him. His wife, Sachiko, filed a 4th retrial request with the Tokyo High Court in the months after his death, continuing a fight that had now outlasted the man who began it. Japan's retrial system is, by international standards, extremely difficult to access. A conviction is extraordinarily hard to reverse, even in the face of new forensic evidence. Critics have argued for years that the system is built to treat finality as a value in itself. That once convicted, a person remains convicted, because reopening cases damages institutional credibility. The Sayama case did not change that system during Ishikawa's lifetime. What it did change, slowly and in ways harder to measure, was the public conversation about Buraku discrimination and about the reliability of confessions obtained under extended detention. The case became a central rally point for the Buraku liberation movement for more than 60 years. It is studied in Japanese law schools. It is cited in international human rights reports to the United Nations. Alongside the Hakamada case, where a man spent 48 years on death row before being acquitted in 2024, the Sayama incident is one of the 2 cases cited most often by scholars who argue that Japan's justice system conflates conviction with truth. We may never know who killed Yoshi Nakata on that May afternoon in 1963. The man who walked away from her sister at midnight was never found. If Ishikawa didn't do it, and the evidence, read carefully, raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered, then whoever did is either long dead or has spent 60 years in silence with that knowledge. What remains is a 31-year imprisonment, an 86-year struggle, a fountain pen with the wrong ink, and a conviction that still stands. If you stayed with this story, thank you. These are not easy ones. The cases that stay with you longest are usually the ones without a clean resolution, and this is emphatically one of them. If this channel is something you find valuable, subscribing keeps this work going. And I'll see you in the next episode.